The boarding announcement came through the station speakers in a language Myra Vaskin had spent 3 years learning and still could not fully trust. She stood on the platform of Karova 7 Transit Hub, the kind of station that smelled like recycled air and old grief, and watched the tram slide in from the eastern tunnel. It was not the tram she had been waiting for. She knew the routes. Everyone who worked the outer rings knew the routes the way they knew the lines on their own hands. Route 12 was the slow crawl to the agricultural sectors. Route 9 went deep into the industrial corridors, where the Velthori ran their refineries on a 26-hour cycle that had nothing to do with any sun Myra had ever stood beneath. Route 4 was the administrative connector, the one the Velthori officials took from the transit hub to the sector offices, sitting in their separate compartments with their membrane hoods raised, not looking at anything human. The tram that came in was Route 4. Myra did not work Route 4. She worked the dispensary counter on level 3, handing out nutrition supplements to the residential blocks, logging intake numbers on a tablet that the Velthori network updated every 6 hours whether she touched it or not. She was not supposed to be on a platform at all. She had a work pass that specified her movement corridor, and this platform was outside it, and she had 12 minutes before the corridor check drone made its sweep. She got on the tram anyway. The doors were the old kind, pneumatic, hissing slightly, the kind the transit authority had been promising to replace for 2 years. Inside, the lighting ran in the pale violet spectrum the Velthori preferred, which made human skin look slightly wrong, like fruit left too long in a cold room. There were 4 other passengers, 2 men in the gray worksuits of the maintenance crews, not looking at each other, an older woman with a cloth bag on her lap, staring at the floor. And at the far end of the car, separated from the rest by the invisible but absolute distance that everyone on Karova maintained around authority, a Velthori transit official in his pale carapace uniform, the antenna nodes on his collar twitching as he processed something on his internal feed. Myra sat in the second row and put her hands in her lap and looked at nothing. The tram moved. She had ridden Route 4 once before, 8 months ago, when she had been assigned to deliver a physical document to the sector administrative office. The Velthori sometimes required physical documents, a bureaucratic tick that no human administrator had ever been able to explain. That time, she had been terrified the entire ride, certain that someone would ask for her pass, that the transit official would scan her and find the discrepancy, and she would spend 3 days in the compliance interview rooms, which were not rooms you wanted to spend 3 days in. Nothing had happened, no one had asked. She had delivered the document and ridden back on Route 9 and eaten half a nutrition bar in the stairwell of her residential block, and felt the specific, exhausting relief of a person who has gotten away with something that should not have required getting away with. This time she was not terrified. This was different, and she knew it, and the difference sat in her chest like a stone she had swallowed too quickly. This time she had heard about the woman at the end of Line 4. The tram passed through the connector tunnel, and the city opened up on both sides. Not a beautiful opening, not the kind of vista that made you feel something good, but the vast utilitarian sprawl of Karova 7 in its occupation-era configuration. Blocks of residential housing in the human sectors, low and dense and gray. The refinery towers in the Velthori industrial zone, their upper sections disappearing into the atmospheric processing haze. The transit lines threading between them like veins in something that had stopped being healthy a long time ago. Myra looked at it and thought, I have been here for 11 years. She had been 23 when the transit ships came. Everyone remembered where they were. The broadcasts had started as emergency civil alerts, and then gone silent for 6 hours, and then come back as something else entirely. A different signal, a carrier wave no human engineer had designed, running through every communication network on the planet simultaneously. There had been 17 hours of that signal before the ships entered the upper atmosphere. By then, Most governments had already issued the order to stand down. She had been in her third year of medical studies. Psychiatry, specifically, the study of what happens to the human mind when it is placed under conditions the human mind was not built to withstand. She had found the irony funny for about 2 weeks after the occupation began. Then she had stopped finding it funny and had not really found anything funny since. The tram slowed. A stop she didn't recognize. The signage was in Velthori script, which she could read haltingly, and she made out something that translated roughly as secondary administrative intake. 2 of the maintenance workers got off. The older woman didn't move. The transit official remained at the far end, his antenna node still. A man got on. He was human, which she registered automatically the way everyone did in the outer rings, not as comfort exactly, but as a different category of attention. He was perhaps 60, with the particular kind of face that had been handsome once and had not so much aged as been worn down, the way stone gets worn down by water. He wore a civilian passband on his left wrist, level 2 clearance, the kind that let you move through 3 route corridors instead of 1. His clothes were clean. He sat down across the aisle from Myra without looking at her. She looked at him for a moment longer than she should have. There was something about the way he held himself, a stillness that was not relaxed. The stillness of a person who had spent a very long time practicing how not to react to things. She looked away. The tram moved again. The woman at the end of line 4. That was how the information had come to her, not through any channel she could have explained to a compliance interviewer, but through the slow, careful human network that the Velthori did not fully understand because it did not run on anything they could scan. A word here, a look there. Someone passing a folded piece of paper in a dispensary queue, not a message exactly, more like a coordinate, a location, a time. A woman at the end of line 4 who knew things. Myra did not believe in things. She had been trained briefly in the scientific method, and she had been living for 11 years in conditions that had corroded a great deal of what she used to believe, and what remained was a very stripped-down relationship with evidence. She did not believe in rumors. She did not believe in hope as a strategy. She had watched too many people sustain themselves on hope, and then break in a specific, irreparable way when the hope turned out to be what it usually was. But she was on this tram. So she believed in something. She just hadn't named it yet. The connector tunnel gave way to the outer administrative district. A different texture of city out here, wider spacing between buildings, the Velthori aesthetic becoming more pronounced. Their architecture did not try to impose itself on the landscape. It tried to grow out of it, or to look like it had, which was either more respectful or more deeply strange depending on how you looked at it. Buildings that curved, surfaces that were not quite walls, structural members that branched the way trees branched, except nothing about them was random. Everything the Velthori built was the result of a calculation that humans could not fully follow and had mostly stopped trying to. The old man across the aisle shifted slightly. Myra noticed without meaning to. He had taken something out of his pocket, small, flat, the kind of object you'd only notice if you were watching for it. He held it in his palm for a moment, not looking at it, and then closed his fingers around it. She looked away again. What she had been told in the compressed, deniable language of the outer ring network. A woman at the last stop of Route 4. Not a Velthori woman. Human. Older than most people who came from outside the residential sector clearance got to be without explanation. She sat at the bench at the end of the line every day, and she watched people get off the tram, and some of them she spoke to, and the ones she spoke to came back different. Not healed, not helped in any way you could specify, just different, like they had put something down that they'd been carrying for so long they'd stopped noticing the weight. Myra's hands were in her lap, and she became aware, in the particular way you become aware of things you've been not noticing, that they were shaking slightly. Not fear, or not only fear. The other thing, the thing she had been trying not to name for 11 years, because naming it felt like an indulgence she couldn't afford. Grief, simple grief. Her daughter was 8 years old and lived in the residential block with Myra and slept in the second bunk and called Myra Mama and had never known any world except this one. And Myra loved her with a force that was sometimes indistinguishable from terror. Her daughter was 8 years old and had already learned, without being taught, not to ask about certain things. That was the grief, not the occupation as an abstraction. Not the loss of a world she used to live in. The specific loss of a future her daughter should have been able to expect. The kind of future where the question of what you wanted to be when you grew up was not circumscribed by a clearance level you'd been assigned before you could speak. The tram was slowing. End of line 4. The sign was in both scripts here, a concession to the residential workers who sometimes had business in the administrative district. The Velthori words first, larger. The human letters below, smaller, like an afterthought. Karova Sector Administrative Terminal, end of route. The transit official rose smoothly and moved to the doors. He did not look at any of the passengers. The older woman gathered her cloth bag. The old man across the aisle did not move. Myra stood up. She walked to the doors and stepped off the tram onto a platform that was quieter than the transit hub, fewer people, better lighting, the same violet spectrum but more of it, which somehow made it worse. The platform opened onto a wide concourse with Velthori administrative buildings on 3 sides, and on the 4th, a series of low benches facing a narrow strip of what might generously have been called a garden. The Velthori had planted something in it. The plants were not native. They were something else, something that grew in coiling patterns and had a faint bioluminescence in the lower light spectrums. The bench nearest the garden was occupied. Myra's heart did something complicated. The woman was old, genuinely old, which on Karova 7 meant something, because the elderly in the outer residential blocks did not tend to end up in well-lit concourses near administrative terminals. She was small, bundled into a coat that was either very good or very old, the kind of coat you inherited rather than bought. Her hair was white and pulled back simply. Her hands were in her lap, and she was not reading anything, not looking at a device, not doing the thing everyone did to avoid occupying space in public. She was simply sitting, looking at the garden, present in a way that Myra found immediately, inexplicably difficult to look at directly. She sat down on the far end of the bench. Neither of them spoke for a while. From here, Myra could see the tram route back. Route 4, the connector. The maintenance workers were gone. The other woman was gone. The transit official was processing something at a kiosk near the entrance to the first administrative building. Ordinary. Everything was ordinary. The old woman on the bench said, without turning, "You came on the right day." Her voice was low and even. Not Russian, she spoke the common that had emerged in the outer ring sectors, a Creole of whoever happened to have ended up there, smooth with use. "I don't know what day that is," Myra said. "Today," a slight pause. "Most days are right if you're willing to be here for them." Myra looked at her hands, still now. "They say you know things," she said, not asking. "People say things about me that I don't entirely recognize," the old woman said. "What I do is listen, and sometimes I tell people what I've noticed, about themselves mostly. People come a long way to hear things they already know. That seems like a waste of their time." "Sometimes knowing and hearing are different," the woman said. "You can carry a fact for a decade and it lives in your head like data, dry, something to file. Then someone says it out loud in air and it becomes real. It lands differently." She glanced at Myra for the first time and her eyes were dark and very clear. "What did you come here for?" Myra opened her mouth, closed it. She had come here for what exactly? She could have named a dozen practical things. Information, resources, a contact in the outer network. Something useful, something that served a purpose, something she could justify. "I don't know," she said. The old woman, nodded as if this was the right answer. "What do you do?" she asked. "I work a dispensary counter, level 3 residential. Before, I was a medical student, psychiatry." A small silence. Something moved in the garden, one of the coiling plants responding to a pressure change, or to the light, or to whatever governed the behavior of things that were not from here. "That's a particular kind of studying," the old woman said. "What breaks people, what holds them together, what they do when they can't tolerate what's been done to them." "I suppose. And what have you concluded from the last 11 years? Myra looked at the garden. The plants had a slow, patient quality. They did not hurry. They existed on a timescale that had nothing to do with her. "That people are more durable than I expected," she said. "And that durability isn't always the same as being okay." "No," the old woman said, "it isn't." A pause. "What are you not tolerating?" The question landed the way the woman had said things landed, differently than expected, in a place she hadn't been bracing for. "My daughter is 8 years old," Myra said. She doesn't know what it was supposed to be like. She knows this. She thinks this is normal. She is growing up thinking that this is what the world is, and I can't." She stopped. "You can't what?" "I can't figure out whether I'm supposed to be protecting her from knowing it was different, or whether I'm failing her by not making sure she knows." The old woman was quiet for a moment. "Both," she said. "You're doing both right. Protecting and failing are the same action right now. You haven't found the third option yet." "Is there one?" "There's always a third option. You're just not at the part of the story where you can see it." Myra almost said something sharp about stories. She had been at the part of her life where she didn't believe in the narrative logic of stories, in arcs, in turning points, in the idea that things were building towards something. 11 years of occupation had been thorough instruction in the absence of narrative logic. But she didn't say it. Something stopped her. "The Velthori think we're simple," Myra said instead. "I know. They documented it in the first year. There were translations. Some of the early administrative files were in both scripts when they were still establishing the protocols. Someone I knew had access to a segment of the documentation, what they wrote about us." She paused. "They called us sequentially adaptive. It was a category, like a species notation. They meant that we adapted one step at a time, that we couldn't process complex simultaneous variables the way they could. That our intelligence was fundamentally linear." She said the word with a particular flatness. They were explaining to their own administrators why minimal enforcement would be sufficient. We were too simple to coordinate effectively. And were they wrong? About the coordination, yes, they underestimated what people do when you take everything else away. A pause. About the simplicity, I used to want to say yes, completely wrong, but she stopped again. "But we are linear," Myra said. "We do things one at a time. We get confused by too many variables. We forget things that should be obvious. We are afraid, and fear makes us stupid, and even when we know that, the fear still makes us stupid." She looked at the old woman. "That's real. They weren't entirely wrong." "And you think that means something bad?" "I think it means we have to be clever about it. About what we do with the shape of what we are." She heard herself and almost laughed, a small, exhausted sound. "I can't believe I'm talking like this, to a stranger on a bench." "You've been talking to yourself for 11 years, the old woman said. "Sometimes strangers are easier." The transit official at the kiosk was no longer there. The concourse had emptied slightly, a few human workers crossing in the distance, a Velthori administrator moving with that characteristic fluid efficiency toward the second building. The tram sat at the platform, doors closed, waiting for its return run. "What did you do?" Myra asked. "Before?" "I was an engineer," the old woman said. "Infrastructure, transit systems specifically." She smiled, which changed her face, not younger but more itself. "Trams among other things." Myra looked at the Route 4 tram on the platform. Is that why you sit here? Partly. I understand how they work, the routes, the timing. She looked at the tram with an expression Myra couldn't quite name. I also understand that trams run on fixed lines, that's their nature. They can only go where the tracks already are. People think that's a limitation. She paused. I spent a career learning that it's a design. What do you mean? If you know where the tracks are, all of them, every junction, every connector, then you know where everything on that system has to go eventually. You can't predict everything, but you can know the shape, the system, where things have to converge. She looked at Myra. Do you understand what I'm telling you? Myra thought about it, the dispensary counter, the level 3 residential block. The 11 years of learning the texture of things from the inside, the accumulation of small knowledges, what got logged and what didn't, which nodes of the Velthori administrative network communicated in real time and which had 12-hour delays, which transit routes carried the most human workers, which Velthori administrators were rule followers and which were discretionary, the particular rhythms of a system that had been built for oversight and had, in that building, been forced to run on human hands. You know where the tracks are, Myra said slowly. No, the old woman shook her head. You do. You've been walking them for 11 years. She looked at Myra steadily. I just helped you look at them differently. The tram's doors opened. The announcement came through the speakers, first the Velthori tones, then the human translation, slightly delayed, slightly inferior. All aboard for Route 4 westbound return to Karova 7 Transit Hub. Myra did not move immediately. My daughter's name is Sella, she said, in case it matters, to know that there's a Sella. It matters, the old woman said. Myra stood, she smoothed her jacket. She thought about the dispensary counter, the level 3 block, the tablet that updated every 6 hours, the 12-hour delay in certain administrative nodes, the transit schedules that she had been looking at for 2 years and reading as obstacles, and that she was now, without entirely understanding why, beginning to read as something else. Thank you, she said, not for anything specific because there was nothing specific to name. The woman hadn't given her anything. She had just arranged something, moved something into alignment. Come back, the old woman said, when you found the third option. Myra walked to the tram. She sat down in the second row, the same seat, facing the same direction, the city opening up the same way as the tram pulled out of the terminal and into the connector. The violet light made her skin look wrong. She didn't mind it the same way she had before. She thought about tracks. She had spent 11 years learning this system, the dispensary system, the network update schedules, the administrative communication delays, the transit routes and their timing, the distribution of work passes, the specific mechanics of the nutrition supplement delivery protocol that ran through every residential block in the outer rings, and that the Velthori had never redesigned because it worked, and they did not redesign things that worked. She had learned all of it the way you learn things when you're simply trying to survive, not strategically, not deliberately, just through the slow accumulation of being present in a place long enough to understand it. She had not thought of it as knowledge. She had thought of it as endurance. The tram passed through the residential sector. Through the window, she could see a group of children in the ground-level open space, one of the outdoor zones that the Velthori had allowed under the residential sector protocols, a concession to human psychological requirements that their initial administrative models had underestimated, because they had not accounted correctly for what happened to a population that had no outdoor access. The children were doing what children did, running some complicated chasing game with rules that seemed to shift every few seconds, completely absorbed, their faces very alive. One of them, briefly visible before the tram moved on, had dark hair and a red jacket, and ran with the particular headlong quality of someone who had not yet learned to be careful. Myra put her hand to the window, not touching it, just there. The tram moved. She thought. The supplement delivery protocol ran through a Velthori network hub that had a 12-hour administrative update cycle. During those 12 hours, the physical delivery records, which were still maintained on human-operated tablets because the Velthori had not bothered to fully digitize the physical layer of the supply chain, were the authoritative record, not the network record, the physical tablets. She thought. The transit schedules for routes 4, 9, and 12 created a window on every third day of the 6-day administrative cycle where 3 connectors opened simultaneously, for approximately 40 minutes. She had noticed this years ago because it affected the delivery timing for the blocks in the outer residential rings. She had noted it, filed it, moved on. She thought. The level 2 clearance pass band on the old man's wrist, 3 route corridors. She had seen that kind of band on maintenance supervisors, the ones who needed to move between the industrial and residential sectors. She had also seen it on 3 other people in the last month who did not work maintenance, who did not have any job she could identify, who were simply, sometimes, on the trams. She thought about the shape of a system designed for surveillance, the rails it ran on, where they had to converge. The tram reached Karova 7 Transit Hub. The doors opened. The announcement came through, Velthori first, human second, the small daily reminder of the ordering of things. Myra got off the tram. She had 11 minutes before her next corridor check. She used 2 of them standing on the platform, not moving, just holding what had happened on that bench the way you hold something that has changed temperature unexpectedly. Then she walked back to the dispensary counter and picked up her tablet and logged the morning's supplement delivery and looked at the numbers the way she always did, the same way she had looked at them for 2 years. Except that now she was also looking at something else, underneath, the structure, the shape, where the tracks were. 3 weeks later, she made her second mistake. The first mistake, getting on Route 4 in the first place, had turned out not to be a mistake at all, which meant she had been recalibrating her understanding of mistakes and what they cost. The second mistake was different in kind. It was not an act of private, invisible deviation. It was an act that happened in front of people. A child in residential block 7C had been allocated a supplement ration that was incorrect, not dangerous, not malicious, just the product of a data entry error that had propagated through the network update and would correct itself in 6 hours, at the next cycle. 6 hours was not a long time. But the child was 3 years old and the parents were at their work assignments, and the level 3 supervisor who should have had discretionary override had not come in that morning, and the junior compliance officer from the Velthori administrative sector who was running the daily check decided that the 6-hour correction window was the appropriate resolution. The child was hungry now. The error would correct itself in 6 hours. Myra overrode the system manually. She had the technical access. She was not supposed to use it this way. Override authorities were specified in the work protocol, and this situation did not meet the specified criteria. What she did was clearly, technically, a protocol violation. The compliance officer noted it, filed it. The record went into the administrative queue. She went home that evening and told Sella that sometimes you had to do the thing that was right even when the system said it wasn't allowed. And Sella, who was 8 and had a very direct relationship with moral logic, said yes, obviously, in the tone of someone explaining something to someone slightly slow, and Myra had to press her face into Sella's hair to hide the expression she was making. The compliance record sat in the administrative queue for 2 days. Then it was reviewed by a Velthori sector administrator named Vel Kassenrot. She knew the name because it was in the review notification that came through on her work tablet, and it was resolved as a discretionary exception and closed. Discretionary. She filed that word carefully. On the third day after the incident in Block 7C, the old man from Route 4 was waiting at the dispensary counter when she arrived for her shift. He was not there for supplements. He looked at her with the still, worn-down face she remembered, and he said, "We know what you did." And before she could react to that in any of the ways she had been trained by 11 years of occupation to react, he added, "We've been watching your tablet logs for 4 months." She looked at him. "Who is we?" He set a folded paper on the counter. "Read it later, not here." He straightened. "There's a meeting. You don't have to come, but if you don't come in the next 3 days, we won't approach you again." He paused. "We don't have time to wait for people to be ready. I'm sorry for that." He left. She stood at the counter and served the first 3 people in the morning queue, without being able to fully reconstruct the details of those interactions afterward. Then she unfolded the paper under the counter, reading it with her eyes cast down as if she was looking at her tablet. A location, a time, a route not Route 4, Route 9, the industrial connector. Third stop from the terminal, a maintenance-level junction that she had walked past twice in the last 2 years and had not looked at carefully because it was a maintenance junction and it was not her job. She was not going to go. She went. The meeting was in a space beneath the Route 9 line, an infrastructure cavity, older than the occupation, the kind of space that had been built during the original tram system construction and had never been repurposed because it wasn't large enough to be useful for anything the Velthori cared about. It held 9 people, the old man, 6 others she didn't recognize, and a woman she did recognize, not personally, but by category, the kind of face that had been running something for a long time and had learned to look like it wasn't. There was also a Velthori. Myra stopped. The Velthori sat apart from the others, a young one, by the coloring of the carapace, which shifted in the lower spectrums through paler tones in juvenescence. It had its membrane hood down, which was an exposure Velthori rarely chose in the presence of humans, the membranes being a sensory and communicative organ that functioned something like a face and something like a broadcast antenna, and was considered intensely private. Its eyes, compound, wide spectrum, capable of reading thermal and chemical gradients that humans emitted without knowing it, were tracking her entry. She sat down. Her heart was doing something she was professionally equipped to describe and personally unable to manage. The woman with the running thing's face said, "Thank you for coming," in the common of the outer rings. "My name is Yeva. I'll use one name, you can use one name if you want. This is Velsi." "Velsi it's complicated." "I can translate that," the Velthori said. Its vocal apparatus was not designed for the phoneme range of human common, but it had clearly spent considerable time working with the limitations, because the translation was actually quite good. "I am what your network would call a dissident. The Velthori administration does not recognize dissent as a category, which creates certain practical difficulties." "Why?" Myra said, not what she had meant to say, but it was what came out. "Because the modeling was wrong," Velsi said. "The initial classification of your species, the administrative models built on that classification, the entire architecture of the occupation." It paused, which she was not accustomed to hearing from a Velthori. "I studied your world before I came here, extensively. I still arrived here believing things that were not true." "What things?" "That sequential adaptation was a constraint, not what I understand now to be the engine." She looked at it. It looked back at her, if the wide-spectrum compound gaze of a Velthori could be called looking. "You adapt one thing at a time," Velsi said. "This is accurate, but the administrative models interpreted that as meaning you could only process one variable at a time. This was the error. You process sequentially, but you process everything. You do not simplify. You queue. You accumulate. You build systems of knowledge from the ground level without declaring that you are building systems. And then when the conditions change, when the threshold is reached," it paused again. "We do not have a word for what happens next. The closest translation is probably emergence. Yeva said quietly, Velsi has been mapping the outer ring network for 2 years, the one we run, the one the administration thinks doesn't exist. They know it exists, Velsi said. They do not believe it is capable of coordination above a certain complexity threshold due to the modeling. This is why it has been allowed to persist. The administration does not expend enforcement resources on systems below a viability threshold. We're below the threshold, the old man said, not proud, not bitter, just noting it. You were, Velsi said. You are approaching the threshold now. Not because you have grown, because the modeling is wrong and eventually wrong models produce visible errors, and when the administration is forced to revise, it's stopped. There is a window, before the revision is implemented, between the error becoming visible and the response being designed. The silence in the cavity was complete, except for the distant sound of a Route 9 tram passing on the line above them. Myra thought about the old woman on the bench, about tracks, about the shape of a system. How long is the window, she said. Approximately 11 weeks, based on the current administrative communication schedule and the processing time for a modeling revision of this scale. And what do we do in 11 weeks? Yeva looked at her. The kind of look that is actually an assessment, careful and quick. We need the supplement distribution protocol, she said. The full system, every node, every update cycle, every physical record point. She paused. We need to know where the food goes, because we're going to need to move a lot of people, and people cannot be moved without food, and the food system is the only distribution infrastructure that runs through every residential block in the outer ring simultaneously. Myra's tablet, the delivery records, the physical layer the Velthori had never bothered to fully digitize. 2 years of supplement distribution logs. She had memorized them without meaning to. You could not spend 2 years entering those numbers and not carry the shape of them somewhere in your body. She thought, the woman on the bench. The third option you can't see from where you're standing. The shape of things you've been walking without knowing you were mapping. I know the protocol, she said. I know all of it, every cycle, every node, every route. She did not add, and I know which administrative processing delays create windows that last 40 minutes on every third day of the 6-day cycle. She did not add, and I know which sector administrator has a discretionary exception pattern in his compliance review record that suggests he is not fully aligned with standard enforcement policy. She did not add any of the things she had been accumulating because she had learned to queue, to hold, to wait for the right junction. She just said, tell me what you need. 11 weeks was not a long time and was also long enough, which turned out to be a description that applied to a great many things. The work was not dramatic. None of it was dramatic. It was a dispensary counter and a tablet and supplement logs and a maintenance junction and 9 people and 1 Velthori, and a great deal of very careful, very sequential processing of variables. It was Myra sitting at the counter in the evenings after her shift, going over delivery routes in her head, cross-referencing with the transit schedules she had long since memorized, identifying the 40-minute windows on the 3-day cycle, building in her mind a structure that she had not known she was building. It was the old man. His name, she learned, was Dmitri, and before the occupation he had been a civil engineer with a specialty in infrastructure systems, which was perhaps why he and the old woman at the end of Line 4 had found each other, spending 3 weeks rebuilding a segment of the physical delivery network, so that it ran through 2 additional junction points that happened to also be accessible from the Route 9 maintenance cavity. It was Yeva running the outer ring network with the specific quality of attention of someone who had been doing it for a long time and had learned that the work was not inspiring, that it was mostly administrative, that the inspiring part, the part that made it worth doing, was what the administrative work was for. It was Velsi sitting in the maintenance cavity with its membrane hood down, doing something to the administrative communication system that Myra did not fully understand and did not ask about, because she had spent 11 years learning which questions were worth the asking, and this was not one of them. And it was Myra herself at the counter doing her job, logging supplement deliveries, running her tablet, serving the queue, being exactly what the administrative models had categorized her as: a sequentially adaptive, linear, insufficient human below the complexity threshold, not worth the enforcement resource expenditure. She had a daughter named Sella, who was 8 years old and wore a red jacket and ran with her whole body. She had 2 years of supplement distribution logs memorized to the junction node level. She had 11 weeks. On the 43rd day, the compliance record flagged. Not hers, a different one in a different block, a discrepancy in the delivery log for blocks 12C through 12F that had been created by Dimitri's restructuring of the physical network, and that was, by design, visible in the Velthori administrative system. Visible and confusing. A discrepancy that did not resolve cleanly against any of the standard error categories, which meant it would be routed to a sector administrator for discretionary review. Vel Kassenrot, the discretionary exception, the administrator with the pattern. He reviewed it. He filed it as a data entry, anomaly pending next cycle correction. He did not investigate. On the 51st day, Velc said quietly in the maintenance cavity that the modeling revision had begun, earlier than expected. The window was still open, but it was narrowing. 6 weeks to 10 days. They moved the timeline. What Myra did not tell Sella, because Sella was 8 and some things were not for 8-year-olds. There were 2,847 people in the outer residential blocks who were on the distribution list. The distribution list was Myra's list. The tablet, 2 years of entries. What Myra had spent 3 weeks doing in the evenings carefully, creating a second mapping of that list, not by residential block, by transit route, by the 40-minute windows, by the junctions that Dimitri had rebuilt. A distribution map that was also, if you read it a different way, a movement map. Not everyone. That had been the hardest conversation in the cavity with Yeva and Dimitri and the others. Not everyone. The resources were not there. The window was not long enough. The capacity of the Route 9 maintenance corridors, which connected to the deep infrastructure below the administrative district, which connected, through a series of passages that Velc had identified, and that Myra would not have known to ask about and did not ask about now, to a sector outside the Velthori administrative zone, was not unlimited. Who then? She had sat with that question for 4 days, not pushing it away, sitting with it the way you sit with a patient who needs to speak but hasn't found the words yet. The way she had been trained to do, years ago, in a different life. Children first. That was the first thing, and it was not complicated once she let herself say it. Children first, and then the adults who were essential to moving the children, and then the people with specific knowledge, the maintenance supervisors, the medical workers, the 2 former engineers in the network. And then, to the extent the window allowed, the people who had been in the outer rings longest, who had adapted the most, who had the most of the accumulated sequential knowledge that turned out to be, against all administrative modeling, the thing that mattered. Sella would be in the first movement. Myra would be in the last. This also was not complicated once she said it. On the 61st day, the 40-minute window opened at 3:40 by the administrative clock, which was 3:40 in the violet-lit corridors of the outer residential blocks, and also the least surveilled period of the 6-day administrative cycle. And Myra stood at the junction of the supplement delivery route and the rebuilt network node, and watched the first group of children move through the passage with the focused, quiet efficiency of people who had been told exactly where to go and who had understood, without needing it explained, that now was when you did not make noise. Sella held the hand of a 5-year-old boy she didn't know. Myra watched her disappear into the corridor. She stood at the junction for the remaining 31 minutes of the window, watching the flow, counting, cross-referencing against the list in her head. When the window closed, she walked back to the dispensary counter and picked up her tablet and logged the supplement delivery for Block 12C through 12F. She did this on the third day of every 6-day cycle, for 4 more cycles. On the last cycle, she was the second-to-last person through. The last person was Dmitri. He waited until she was past the junction, and then he made a modification to the rebuilt network node that Velc had designed, and that Myra did not understand but recognized as the thing that meant no one could follow the path they had taken. He did it with the unhurried efficiency of a civil engineer, who had spent his career understanding that the most important work is usually invisible. Then he followed her. The passage was not comfortable. It was not designed for comfort. It was infrastructure, which was a word that meant something that existed to serve a purpose and did not care how you felt about it. Myra had spent enough time thinking about infrastructure in the last 11 weeks that she had developed a certain respect for it. You did not have to like the tram. The tram ran anyway. That was the point. She emerged into a space that was different. Lower ceiling, different air, the particular quality of silence that comes from being far enough from a transit line that you cannot hear it anymore. Other people were there already. She could see faces in the low light, some she knew, some she didn't. A child's hand finding its mother's arm, the specific sound of people breathing differently when the held breath can finally let go. Sela found her in the dark. She ran with the same headlong quality as always, the same complete commitment to forward motion, and hit Myra's arms with a force that was disproportionate to her size. And Myra held on, face pressed into dark hair, feeling the small, fierce presence of her daughter, who was 8 years old and had never known any world except the one they had just left. Who would now? Were you scared? Sela asked, muffled into Myra's shoulder. Myra thought about the answer, the real one, not the parental one. Yes, she said. Me too, a pause, Sela pulling back enough to look at her. But I was scared in the right direction. That's different. Myra looked at her daughter's face in the low light. The face of someone who had worked something out, reached a conclusion by the direct, linear logic that 8-year-olds applied to things. The same logic that the Velthori administrative models had dismissed as primitive, as insufficient, as below the complexity threshold for meaningful coordination. Sequential, she thought, we process everything, we queue, we accumulate, we wait for the threshold. Yes, she said, it's different. In the weeks that followed, the Velthori administrative system registered a compliance anomaly in the supplement distribution records for the outer residential sector. The anomaly did not map cleanly onto any existing error category. It was routed to Vel Kassenrot for discretionary review. The review took 11 days, longer than usual, long enough that the second phase administrative response was delayed. The delay cost the response team the capacity to triangulate the movement pathways in the maintenance infrastructure before the passages were sealed. When the revised enforcement protocol was finally implemented, there was a window it arrived too late to close. Velc's modeling had predicted this. Myra could have told them the same thing if they had asked, and if she had been there, and if she had thought the administration would listen. That a system built on wrong premises eventually generates errors it cannot resolve within its own framework. That when the threshold is reached, the response time matters. That you could categorize the humans in your outer residential blocks as sequentially adaptive and linear and insufficient, and below your complexity threshold. And you could be technically correct about every single one of those descriptors, and still arrive at your enforcement response 11 days too late. Because you had modeled the constraint, not the engine. 11 months later, in a space that was not a tram and not a maintenance cavity and not a dispensary counter, a space with actual daylight, actual unfiltered spectrum, the kind of light that made human skin look like itself. Myra sat on a bench and watched a group of children running a chasing game with rules that shifted every few seconds. Sela was in the middle of it. She had made friends with a specific, rapid intensity that Myra suspected was partially a response to knowing, in some 8-year-old way, that friendship was something that could be interrupted. She played with a ferocity that was sometimes alarming to watch. The old man, Dmitri, sat down next to Myra. He had a cup of something and he handed her one and she took it and did not immediately drink it, just held the warmth. "Message came through," he said. "Outer rings, the network is still running." "I know. Velsi says the second modeling revision is underway. Longer timeline this time, more conservative." "I know that too." He was quiet for a moment. "The woman at the end of line 4, you should know she made it out. In the first movement." Myra looked at her cup, the warmth of it in her palms. "She didn't tell me her name," she said. "She rarely does." Dmitri looked at the children. Sela had achieved some sort of advantage in the game and was running with complete physical commitment toward a goal that was invisible to anyone who didn't know the rules. "She says she'll sit somewhere else now, find another bench, see who comes. Another end of a line. She says all lines end somewhere, and people generally know when they've reached the end of where they can get by themselves." Myra drank the thing in the cup. It was hot and bitter, and she did not know what it was made from, and it was the best thing she had tasted in a long time. She thought about tracks, about the shape of a system when you finally learn to read the structure underneath the surface, about 11 years of supplement logs that she had carried without knowing she was carrying a map, about a psychiatry student who had never quite finished her studies and had spent 11 years learning, in the most direct possible way, what happened to people when you placed them under conditions they were not built to withstand. What held them together. What they did with the shape of what they were. Sela was laughing at something. A real laugh, unreserved. The kind that was maybe only possible because you were 9 now, and you knew what it felt like to run in the right direction. She was laughing and running, and her red jacket was very bright in the actual unfiltered light, and Myra watched her daughter and thought, there is a third option. There is always a third option. You are just not at the part of the story where you can see it yet. But you keep going, sequential. One thing at a time, you accumulate, you queue, you wait. And then you emerge.